Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I'm getting over a cold, so if you can't hear me speaking, just kind of raise your hand or let me wave a little bit so that I'll know to hold the microphone a little bit closer. Thank you for that really nice introduction, and thank you all for being here and for being the taxpayers that support what I do. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work that we do in our group today. So as she said, we are the Laboratory for Space Sciences, and this is our group logo here. And basically it represents the way we think about our work. So we analyze extraterrestrial samples in the laboratory in order to try to understand the origin and evolution of the solar system and also the galaxy around us. And so in essence, what we're doing is astronomy with a microscope rather than a telescope. So our work is actually quite interdisciplinary in nature, and we have people with backgrounds from chemistry, physics, astronomy, and also earth science. And my own background is in earth sciences or geology. And before I get into the science part of this talk, I just want to sort of give a few words about how I got where I am today. So it's kind of a standard narrative, I think, that a lot of scientists know that this is what they want to do when they grow up. They know it at a young age. But that wasn't the case for me, actually, at all. So this was me as a kid. I loved books and reading, and I couldn't imagine anything better than to grow up to be a librarian and be surrounded by books all day. Well, by the time I got to college, that had sort of fallen by the wayside, but I really hadn't figured out what I wanted to do. And so I spent a lot of time taking different courses and looking at different things, and it wasn't really until I reached my senior year in college that I figured out what that something was going to be. And that happened when I took an Introduction to Geology course. And from that point on, I was really kind of hooked. So I loved rocks and I loved minerals and everything that had to do with geology. So in essence, what I had to do is actually start over with another major then. And a couple of years into that whole process, a professor kind of randomly stopped me in the hallway one day and asked me whether I wanted to work on the lunar rocks that came back from the Apollo missions. Well, I'd never actually even thought about that you could even study those kind of samples. So I was thrilled and did that, and that's how I got into planetary science and cosmochemistry. So I did my Ph.D. at Washington University, as Denise said, and then after spending a few years in Heidelberg working, I came back to the same group that I had done my graduate work in, and I've been here ever since. So with that introduction, let's talk about the science now. Okay, so this is just a sort of an overall picture of broadly how our solar system formed. So our solar system originated about 4.5 billion years ago, and from this sort of large cloud of gas and dust. And a lot of that material coalesced into the center, of course, to form our sun, but some of it also became the planets and asteroids and comets that we have in our solar system. And we have samples from a lot of these solar system bodies that we can use to study this whole process of solar system formation. So, for example, we have rocks from the moon that were returned by the astronauts in the Apollo missions. And our lab, actually, way back in the early 70s, was one of several groups that got the first lunar samples that were returned by Apollo 11. And this was actually a big focus of our group for many years. We also have meteorites, and meteorites come from several different bodies in the solar system. The majority of them come from asteroids in the asteroid belt, but we also have samples that we know come from the moon and from Mars. And meteorites, of course, fall all over the Earth, but NASA actually carries out dedicated searches for meteorites in Antarctica every year. And the reason for that is that meteorites get concentrated in the ice there, and so that makes them a lot easier to find. And actually 2 years ago, I was lucky enough to be selected to be one of the people to go and look for meteorites in Antarctica. And this right here is our team the year that I went. And I have to say, this was really one of the best experiences of my life. It was absolutely amazing. So another type of extraterrestrial sample that we have are interplanetary dust particles, or IDPs. And these are thought to come mostly from asteroids and comets, and they're collected in our stratosphere by high-altitude airplanes that NASA flies, such as the one that you see right there. Well, for these IDPs, we have to assume origins in either asteroids or comets, but for any given particle, we can't really be 100% sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's very quiet.
Oh.
You can go and project.
Okay. Oops. Let's go back. Okay, so can you hear me sort of okay? Yeah. I'll try again. Okay, we actually also do have cometary dust that we know comes from a comet, and this is because NASA flew a mission to a comet called Wild 2 a number of years ago and returned samples to it in 2006. And our group also was involved in studying these particular samples. So we have all of these extraterrestrial samples from different solar system bodies, and we can use them to try to understand how these bodies originated and also how the solar system overall originated. And then one final component that's present in a number of these extraterrestrial samples are presolar grains, or stardust. And these have been a big focus of the work that we do in our group for a couple of decades now, and that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my talk today. Okay, let's see if that's better. Oh, that does seem to be better. Okay, so what exactly are presolar grains? Well, basically, these are just dust-sized particles that are older than the solar system. And they were present in that cloud of gas and dust from which our solar system formed. And a small fraction of those actually survived that whole process of solar system formation, and they were incorporated into certain solar system materials that really haven't changed much throughout the entire history of the solar system. And they're only present really in trace concentrations in meteorites, but they're important because they do come from stars that existed before our solar system formed, and so they can provide us with information about these stars. So I just want to say a few words about scale here. So presolar grains are very small. They're much smaller than anything you can see with the naked eye. And so the scale here goes from meters on the right, so sort of people-sized objects, all the way down to angstroms on your left, down to sort of sizes of individual atoms. And presolar grains fall in that region right in there. So they're somewhat larger than viruses and a little bit smaller than red blood cells. And they're considerably smaller, actually, than the width of a single strand of human hair. So that gives you sort of some kind of a reference point. Okay, so stars are important because this is where the elements originate. So most of the hydrogen and helium in our universe actually was created in the early stages of the Big Bang. But elements that are heavier than hydrogen and helium are produced by stellar fusion processes in stars or in supernova explosions. And this process by which new elements are formed is known as nucleosynthesis. So our understanding of how stars, or how the elements form in stars, is actually relatively recent. It only dates back to about the 1950s with the publication of this classic paper called Synthesis of the Elements in Stars. And it's commonly referred to in our field as B2FH after the four authors, Burbage, Fowler, and Hoyle. And so up until that time, people had basically thought that all of the elements formed in the Big Bang, and that therefore the abundances of all the different elements was relatively constant throughout the universe. Well, with this paper, these authors argued that elements actually form in different stars. And one of the predictions that comes out of that understanding of where elements form is that younger stars are going to have higher abundances of heavier elements than older stars are. And in fact, this is exactly what astronomers have observed. So we use these presolar grains that we have to try to understand this whole process of element formation in stars in more detail. Okay, so this just these schematics sort of show you in broad terms the different stages that stars go through in their lifetimes. So stars start out on your left-hand side there, and stars have different masses. So there's typical stars like our sun, but there are also much more massive stars. But both types actually spend the bulk of their lifetimes in that very first stage there, and this is the time when they are converting hydrogen in their cores into helium, and this process is known as hydrogen burning. So stars stay in that process until they've run out of hydrogen in their cores, and after that they turn into red giant stars or red supergiant stars and begin burning heavier elements. For relatively low mass stars like our sun, after the red giant stage, they turn into planetary nebulae, and they're surrounded by this sort of cloud of ionized gas. And then when they run out of fuel completely, they end up as white dwarfs. More massive stars then, once they're finished with the red supergiant phase, will explode as supernovae and then end up as either neutron stars or black holes. So this is another way of looking at stellar evolution, the one that astronomers commonly use. And this is known as a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, or HR diagram. And so what you've got plotted there is temperature on the x-axis versus luminosity on the y-axis, simply how bright the star is. And that first stage of that stars spend most of their lifetimes in corresponds to this black line that you see going through the middle of the diagram there. And stars will fall on different parts of that black line depending on what their mass is. And this is known as the main sequence line. So for example, our star, let's see if I can use this pointer, whoops. Not very well. So our star actually falls right here at 1 solar mass. So these are expressed in numbers of solar masses. So this is our star right down here, and then more massive stars fall up here further up on the main sequence line. And they stay on this main sequence line for the entire time that they're doing this hydrogen burning in their cores. Once they've finished burning hydrogen and move on to the next stage, they go off onto these other branches here and become either red giant stars or AGB stars. AGB stars are, AGB stands for asymptotic giant branch, and you don't need to worry about what that is. That's sort of a slightly different version of a red giant star. So stars with higher masses, they also go off of this main sequence line and then end up exploding as supernovae, as I mentioned. So our sun, of course, is on the main sequence right now. It's burning hydrogen in its core, and right now it is about this size right here. When it moves to the red giant phase, it's going to get much larger. It'll expand quite a bit further out into the solar system. Probably will be engulfing Mercury at least, but some estimates are higher, suggesting that might even engulf Venus and the Earth. In either case, obviously conditions are going to be very different on Earth than they are right now, and probably not very conducive to life. But we don't really have to worry about this because this is not going to happen for another 5 billion years. So you guys are all okay. All right. So these dust grains don't actually form in the cores of stars because the temperatures and pressures are far too high for that. The dust grains in these red giant stars, will form sort of in the outer regions of the star when temperatures and pressures have gotten low enough so that minerals can actually condense. And in the case of supernovae, the dust grains tend to form in the ejecta that comes out of the supernova explosion. All right, so one obvious question about presolar grains is how do we actually know that they're presolar? And to answer that question, we have to do a little bit of chemistry review. So this is just an example of an atom. This is a lithium atom here. And so in the nucleus of an atom, you've got protons and neutrons. In the case of lithium, we have 3 protons and 4 neutrons. And then this nucleus, of course, is surrounded by a number of electrons. So the atomic number of an element is simply the number of protons that it has, which is 3 in the case of this lithium atom. And the atomic mass of an atom is simply the sum of the number of protons and neutrons. And so the atomic number is actually unique for every element, but most elements actually have several different configurations in their nuclei with different numbers of neutrons, and these are called isotopes. So isotopes are simply an element with the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. So another example here for oxygen, which we're also going to be talking about in more detail later. So oxygen has 3 isotopes, oxygen 16, 17, and 18. So all of them have 8 protons in the nucleus, but different numbers of neutrons, either 8, 9, or 10. And here on Earth and in the majority of the solar system, the bulk of the oxygen is present as oxygen 16. So more than 99% of oxygen is oxygen 16. And 17 and 18 make up only very small fractions of that. But this is actually very different in stars because these elements are formed in the stars, and different processes will form these different isotopes in vastly different proportions. And so this is how we can distinguish presolar grains, by looking at their isotopic compositions and seeing how different they are from what we see on Earth and in the rest of the solar system. Okay, so I want to go a little bit into the story of how presolar grains were first identified. So even though by the 1950s people knew that a lot of different stars had contributed material to this cloud of gas and dust that our solar system came from, and they knew that it must have had vastly different isotopic compositions because it came from a lot of different stars, at the time, people really believed that actually everything had gotten completely homogenized during this process of solar system formation. And there seemed to be evidence supporting this based on bulk analyses of meteorites and lunar samples, which always seem to show the identical isotopic compositions for elements that we see on Earth here. Well, the first hint that this wasn't always the case actually came from measurements of the noble gases. So people would do these bulk analyses and measure the noble gases. And they found a couple of different anomalous components in both xenon and in neon. So these graphs here, on the two on the left, let's get the right one there. And the two on the left, so these are the different isotopes of xenon here, and everything on the Earth and in the rest of the solar system falls along this black line right here, so at 1. So this is all normalized to the solar composition. And so there were two different components found for xenon. One of them is known as this xenon HL because it was enriched in both the heavy isotopes and the light isotopes of xenon. And then the other component was known as xenon S, and that showed depletions in the odd-numbered isotopes of xenon. And then for neon, there were also two components that scientists found, known as neon EH and neon EL. And in this particular diagram, these are ratios are plotted here, and the solar composition is up here. Well, so of course people wanted to find out, what kind of phase is actually carrying these components? Where in the meteorite are these components hosted? And so to do that, they went through this process of basically that has been known as burning down the haystack to find the needle. And so the idea is basically you take your bulk meteorite, you do a lot of chemistry to it, and then and in that manner isolate the presolar grains. Well, so this is the way that this was done in more detail is that they would carry out so very tedious chemical dissolution and physical separation steps. And after every single step, they would analyze the material that was remaining and see whether those anomalous components were still present in that residue. Well, so this was clearly very painstaking work and quite tedious. But after a lot of trial and error, it was actually successful, and the first presolar phases were identified in the late 1980s. So the first phase that was actually identified were nanodiamonds, and nanodiamonds turned out to be the carrier of this xenon HL component. And this picture here is showing you a large agglomeration of nanodiamonds. These are the smallest presolar phase that we have. They're only about 2 to 3 nanometers in size, and each individual nanodiamond only contains about 2,000 atoms total. Another presolar phase that was identified then was silicon carbide, which is also known as carborundum or the mineral moissanite. And silicon carbide turned out to be the carrier phase for this xenon S component and also for the neon EH component. And these silicon carbide grains were considerably larger than the nanodiamonds. They could be as big as a micron or 2 in size, so that would be like a factor of 1,000 larger than the nanodiamonds. But these are still very small grains, so they're still about 50 times smaller than the width of a single strand of human hair. So not large on our normal scale. And then finally, graphite turned out to be the carrier of the neon EL component. And these grains were somewhat larger yet, typically sort of several microns in diameter. Okay, so once we had these presolar phases identified, they could be studied in more detail and to try to find out get information about the stars that they came from. And initially, bulk analyses were done, and these were on large numbers of the grains. And these were good for providing sort of average information. But a particularly powerful approach is to measure individual grains. Because these grains all come from different stars, analyzing individual grains lets you get information about the particular star that grain came from. And this is where we actually got involved in presolar grain research. So a technique called SIMS, or secondary ion mass spectrometry, essentially revolutionized the field of presolar grain research because it allowed us to analyze these grains individually. And this technique was pioneered and developed by, by this man right here. His name is Ernst Zinner, and he was a longtime member of our group and passed away, unfortunately, last year. The development of this technique actually coincided very nicely with the discovery of presolar grains. And since the late 1980s, when these grains were first discovered, our group has really been essentially at the forefront of presolar grain research, thanks to the work that he did. Well, our initial instrument was good for measuring these presolar grains that were individual grains that were on the order of a micron or so in size, but really couldn't analyze grains much smaller than that. And this was fine. This was great for a while in the initial stages of the work. But in the late 1990s, then, a new type of instrument was developed called the nanosims. And with this instrument, we could analyze individual grains down to a couple of 100 nanometers in size. And our group actually worked on the development of this instrument, and we got the first one that was built. It was delivered to our lab in the year 2000. And since that time, we've been able to do a lot more work on presolar grains, analyze them in a lot more detail. And this instrument has also led to a lot of important discoveries. And one of the most important ones is that with this instrument, we were able to identify presolar silicate grains. So most of the presolar phases that had been identified to that point were just sort of single phases with one composition, so silicon carbide or the graphite. But the silicates are actually an entire group of minerals that have different compositions and different structures. All of them are based off of silica tetrahedra that contain oxygen and silicon, and then they contain a number of different elements in addition. And silicates are by far the most common minerals on Earth, make up the vast majority of the minerals on Earth, and also in meteorites. And based on astronomical observations, they were also predicted to be a fairly common presolar phase. But finding these presolar silicates posed some unique challenges that we didn't have with the other grains. And so the most important challenge really was that this process of burning down the haystack to isolate the grains just isn't going to work for presolar silicates. And the reason for that is that the very first step in this whole process involves dissolving away the silicate minerals that make up the bulk of the meteorite. And so obviously the presolar ones are going to be dissolved away at the same time. So what this meant is that you had to basically try to find these grains in situ in the meteorites. And this was also challenging because the grains are very small. And in addition to that, they are surrounded by this vast sea of other silicate minerals that have solar system composition. So basically what this means is you have to, you're looking for a needle in the haystack, but instead of burning down that haystack, you've got to find a way to distinguish the needle from all of the hay. And so the way that we did this was with the oxygen isotopes. So oxygen was the best element for this, for one reason because all silicate minerals contain oxygen, as I mentioned. And in addition to that, based on nucleosynthetic models for how oxygen is formed in stars, there were predictions that it would show large anomalies relative to the solar system compositions. And that did turn out to be the case. So what this shows here is simply an example of how we do these measurements. So these are images that we take of a small part of a meteorite sample, and we image the three different isotopes of oxygen, oxygen 16, 17, and 18. And then we can process those data later on and create sort of ratio maps. So this is oxygen 17 to 16, and here 18 to 16. And even if you don't really understand what's going on here, it's very clear just from looking at the images that you've got something here that's very different from everything else. So this is the needle in our haystack. This is a presolar silicate grain that is strongly enriched in oxygen 17. So this is how we find these grains. So once we have them, what can we learn from these presolar silicates? Well, one of the things we can do is measure their elemental compositions and determine their structures so that we can find out what kind of silicate minerals they actually are. And this is important because astronomers, when they're looking at the spectral features of stars, they have to make assumptions about the kind of phases that are contributing to those spectra. And so by actually determining what silicate minerals are present in presolar grains, we can help them put some constraints on what those assumptions are and make them more accurate. The other thing we can do is measure the isotopes of other elements that are present in the grains. And this gives us information then about what kind of stars they come from. And it also lets us put constraints on the models that theoreticians come up with to explain how the elements form in the different stars by letting them compare the actual grain data with the models that they have. So we learned quite a bit actually already from just from these oxygen isotopes that we use to find the grains in the first place. So this plot here is known as a oxygen 3 isotope plot, and basically it's showing you the compositions of a large number of presolar silicate and oxide grains. So what you're actually looking at here is the ratio of oxygen 18 to 16 on the x-axis here, and 17 to 16 on the y-axis. And the composition in the solar system and on Earth is represented by that dashed line right there. So one thing to notice here is that this is a log-log plot. So each of these tick marks represents a factor of 10. So if you have a grain right up here, for example, this grain like this has about 100 times more oxygen 17 than anything we see in the solar system. And similarly for grains out in this region right here, they have about 100 times less oxygen 18 than what we see in the solar system. So these are huge differences. So another thing that you can see from this plot here is that the grains have been divided up into different groups. And these groups represent different stars that these kinds of grains originated in. So as an example, the group 1 grains that are at the top there, these are actually the most common grains that we find. About 80% of the grains we find belong to this group 1. And the grain that I just showed you a minute ago is actually one of these group 1 grains. So they're strongly enriched in oxygen 17, but their oxygen 18 to 16 ratios are fairly close to the solar value. So these group 1 grains are thought to come from relatively low mass red giant or AGB stars, basically similar to the kind of star that our sun is going to become one of these days. So how do we know this? Well, as I said, theoreticians come up with models for how these elements form in different stars. And one of the principal reactions that is expected is the formation of oxygen 17 from oxygen 16 by way of this reaction here. So what you have here, you simply begin with an oxygen 16 atom and add a proton to it, and then it becomes fluorine 17. Well, fluorine 17 is unstable, and so it'll beta decay and turn into an oxygen 17 atom. And so this process actually occurs during the hydrogen burning stage of a star when it's on the main sequence. So our sun is actually making oxygen 17 by this process right now. Well, when the star then reaches this red giant or AGB phase, as I said before, it expands a lot, gets much larger than it is, and when it does that, it becomes somewhat unstable and it begins to convect, and this convection process leads to some of the material that's in the core of the star. So that's where the 17O rich material is being produced. Some of that material gets pushed up out into the envelope of the star, into the outer regions, and into this dust formation zone where the grains are actually forming. So in this way, the grains that form in this region are incorporating this material that's very enriched in oxygen 17. So when we have good agreement between the models and the grain data, like we do in this particular case, in this particular example, we can be pretty confident both that the models are correct and also that the grains actually do come from the type of star that we think they do. But this isn't always the case, actually. In some cases, the grain data that we obtain doesn't agree very well at all with the models. And so I want to go through an example of that. So backtracking just a bit, I said before that we measure the element compositions of these grains, and this plot here simply shows you the iron contents of the grains for the range in iron contents that we measure in presolar silicates for a number of different meteorites. And so one of the things we found in these presolar silicates is they actually contain quite a bit of iron. So because of that, a couple of years ago, one of my students and I decided that what we would do is measure the isotopic compositions of iron in order to try to understand a little more about how this element is formed in the stars. Okay, so iron has 4 stable isotopes, iron 54, 56, 57, and 58. And so just like in oxygen and other elements, all of these isotopes have 26 protons in their nucleus, but different numbers of different numbers of neutrons. Iron 56 is by far the most abundant on the Earth and in the solar system. More than 90% of our iron is iron 56, and then the other isotopes are present in lower abundances. Well, we decided to do these measurements on these group 1 grains that I've been talking about, mostly just because they are so common and we had a lot of them available for study. So these were grains then that come from these low mass red giant stars. So the nucleosynthesis of iron hasn't been studied in as much detail as it has for oxygen and other lighter elements, but there were some model predictions out there. And for these particular stars that we're talking about, basically, so the iron 54 and 56 are actually produced in supernovae, but in these types of stars, they generally have some iron 54 and 56 already that comes from earlier generations of the star. And so what takes place in these stars then actually is that you have a neutron capture that produces the heavier isotopes of iron, iron 57 and 58. So essentially all you're doing is adding a neutron to the nucleus of the atom that's already there. So what this kind of a model predicts then, so you're using up iron 54 and 56 and making 57 and 58. So the predictions from this kind of a model is that your ratio of iron 54 to 56 is going to stay essentially the same because you're using up both of them. But for iron 57 and 58, you're going to get higher abundances because you're creating those elements in that star. And so if you actually go ahead and do the calculations and plot them, these are the quantitative predictions that you get. So this is another 3-isotope plot for iron in this case. And you've got, in this case, you have iron 54 to 56 on the x-axis and 57 to 56 on your y-axis. And unlike the case for oxygen where we were plotting the actual ratios, in this case what I'm showing here is the difference in the ratio from the solar value. So the dashed lines here for the solar value plot at 0, 0 in this case because there is no difference. And positive numbers in this particular case mean higher abundances than the solar, and negative numbers mean lower abundances than the solar system values. And so, as you can see here, the predictions are that you would get 54 to 56 ratios that are basically fairly close to what you see in the solar system, but you see strongly elevated abundances of iron 57 going up to much higher values than what we see in the solar system. So those are the model predictions. And these then are the grain data that we obtained. So what you see here, the points in blue are the presolar silicate grains that we analyzed, and in addition, so are the points in gray here. And so you can see that what you would expect to see is that all of the grains fall up along this line here, if the model is correct. And we do have one grain right here that does seem to sort of fall along the trend that you would expect. We have a lot of grains that don't show any kind of anomalies. Their compositions are essentially the same as the solar composition, and those don't really tell you a whole lot because there can always be contamination issues that lead you to the grains to just showing a solar composition. But the ones that are really interesting are the ones that are down here. So these grains show depletions in iron 57, exactly the opposite of what the models predict. And in addition to that, some other people from our group had measured some silicon carbide grains a few years earlier that are thought to come from exactly the same type of low-mass stars as the presolar silicates that we were studying. And some of those grains as well, the ones in red here, show exactly the same depletions in iron-57 that we saw in our silicate grains. So basically what you have here is a complete disagreement between what the models are predicting and what the grain data are showing us. And we actually don't have any good explanation for this difference. So clearly there's a lot more work that needs to be done here. We need to measure more grains because we want to find out what the complete range of compositions actually is that the grains are showing us. And obviously the theoreticians need to be working on their models to try to figure out how these grains might have originated, how we get these compositions in stars. Okay, so finally I just want to come back very briefly to the nanodiamonds that I talked about quite a bit earlier. So as I said, these were the first presolar phase to be found, and they're actually also the most abundant presolar phase that we have. But in spite of that, it's turned out that they have actually been the most difficult to understand. And the reason for that has largely to do with the fact that they are so very small, just a few nanometers in size. So even with an instrument like our nanosims, when we try to analyze these nanodiamonds, we can only do bulk analyses. We're measuring thousands of nanodiamonds at a time. And so when we do these measurements, so diamonds, of course, are made of carbon, and when we measure the carbon isotopic ratios of the nanodiamonds, what we find, surprisingly, is that the ratios are exactly the same as the solar value. And this is pretty much the last thing you would expect, because the carbon is the main element present in these nanodiamonds, and if these nanodiamonds are actually presolar, you would expect to see very anomalous compositions in the carbon. So there are several different thoughts about why this might be. One is certainly that maybe we're wrong somehow, that the nanodiamonds actually are solar in origin. Another possibility is that individual nanodiamonds actually show large isotopic anomalies, and that somehow just fortuitously you're getting the average solar system composition when you measure large numbers of them. That's not really very likely, actually. What is somewhat more likely is that some small fraction of the nanodiamonds are presolar and show large isotopic anomalies, but because we're doing these bulk analyses on so many grains, we're just not seeing those anomalies. So ideally what you want to do is measure individual grains, just as we do for all of the other presolar phases. Well, one of my students is actually working on this problem right now for his Ph.D. thesis using a technique called atom probe tomography. And this is a technique that's been widely used in the material sciences, but it has not been applied to this type of problem before. And so without worrying about the details of this graph, the whole idea in atom probe tomography is that you create your sample as this very finely pointed needle-like tip. And then you evaporate individual atoms off of that tip by using a laser, and then you accelerate those atoms and detect them on a detector. Detect them according to their position and the time of arrival on a detector here. And what this allows you to do then is to reconstruct your sample tips with a high degree of accuracy. Well, one of the major challenges that we actually had in trying to apply this technique to our nanodiamonds is figuring out a good way to do the sample preparation. And so again, without going into all of the gory details, with a lot of trial and error, eventually we figured out that the best way to do this was to actually embed the nanodiamonds in layers of platinum and then line the sample so that the nanodiamonds were aligned along the long edge of the tip here. So the dark areas that you see here are nanodiamonds, and most of the rest of this tip is just platinum. And so when we do one of these measurements then and reconstruct the data, this is what it looks like. So here, each of these dots here represents an individual atom in this case. The orange are the platinum atoms, and the black region, the black dots are all of the carbon atoms. So you can see you've got a number of different clusters of carbon-rich areas here, and these correspond to the nanodiamonds that are in the sample. And so what we can do then is look at just these regions that are dominated by carbon and count the different isotopes of the carbon and reconstruct isotopic ratios that way. And so in that manner, we can get isotopic ratios for individual nanodiamonds, or at best sort of clusters of just a few nanodiamonds. So this is work that is really brand new and ongoing. We're at the stage now where we sort of fine-tuned our sample preparation process, and we figured out all of the analytical protocols that we need. And we're starting to measure standards, and we've measured a few of the meteoritic nanodiamonds, but not enough to really be able to say anything exciting. But we expect basically that in the next few years we're going to have some interesting results, and hopefully we'll be able to say something about where these nanodiamonds actually originated. Okay, so that's basically is what tells you about the work that we do in our group. We've all heard that we are Stardust, but in addition to that, we too one of these days will be recycled and will become part of a future generation of stars, as this cartoon shows you. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to work with any samples from Stardust, and are you hoping to get samples from Osiris?
You mean the NASA mission Stardust? Yes, we analyzed. We were quite involved in analyzing the samples from Stardust, and our role largely was looking for presolar grains in those samples. NASA named that mission Stardust largely because they expected to find large numbers of presolar grains in the samples, which turned out not to be the case, actually.
What about Osiris?
OSIRIS-X, we are not directly involved in that right now, but that's so far in the future that those samples are coming back that I'm sure that we'll be involved in it as well. We haven't been involved in the mission planning for it or anything like that. Yes?
Any organic material on any of the meteors, or
maybe
there's life on other planets?
There is quite a bit of organic material in many different meteorites, not in all of them, but there's a group of meteorites called carbonaceous chondrites, and they contain quite a bit of organic material. And people have studied this material, of course, and there are actually organic molecules that are similar to things that we find on Earth. So one of the hypotheses is that these carbonaceous meteorites may have contributed to some of these early organic molecules on the early Earth.
Possibility there's life on other...
Sure hope so. Nobody knows, but yeah. Yes.
How come there isn't iron 55? There's 54, 56, 57, and 58.
Iron 55.
Another neutron.
Yeah, because iron 55 is not stable, and so it decays actually and becomes, I believe it's manganese 55. Take something from over here. Yes.
With regard to the airplane that catches the solar particles, could the structure of those things be changed as they pass through our atmosphere before the plane gets them?
Yes, yes, they can be. So these are not presolar grains, but these are interplanetary dust particles, and some of them do contain presolar grains, but they're somewhat larger. But yeah, depending on how quickly they come in, and how large they are, they can sometimes be modified and heated. So another type of sample that I really didn't talk about are micrometeorites, which are somewhat larger, and they're in a size range where basically all of them, when they go through the atmosphere, they completely melt, and they become these cosmic spherules, actually. They melt and become these little circular balls. More questions?
We had a young gentleman back here. Do you still have a question?
Why is there some parts that are that have less atoms?
That's a good question. Basically, the reason for that is one of the problems with analyzing these nanodiamonds in these tips is that so normally in this technique, one atom is supposed to come off of the sample at a time. Well, carbon turns out to be a very difficult element to measure with this technique. And so what we think sometimes is happening is that instead of just one atom coming off at a time, a whole clump of carbon atoms will come off. And then the detector can't actually detect those very well. And so you end up with these holes in the sample. This has been one of the problems that we've had to deal with in trying to figure out exactly how to do these measurements. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
You said you went to Antarctica, and it's an annual mission for NASA. Why Antarctica?
Because in Antarctica, the meteorites, they fall over tens of thousands of years on the ice there. And as the ice moves, so they get buried in the ice basically over that time period. As the ice moves then, the glaciers are always moving. And if the glacier comes up against some kind of an obstacle where it can't move anymore, like the mountains, then the ice basically evaporates away and those meteorites get exposed to the surface again. And if you have that going on for a long time, they tend to get concentrated. So we do those searches actually like at the base of mountains, and these meteorites get concentrated there. So, okay. Anybody else? Okay.